Welcome to the Emotional Eating Unwrapped podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, an emotional eating and weight loss coach for women looking to fall in love with eating, create healthy attachments with food, and lose weight sustainably. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and I'm happy to be here today. I really like this topic that I'm going to get into because I think there's a lot of confusion around this topic, and I'm excited today to just explain the difference between binging and overeating. And I think it's really important to just parse out that these two things are not the same. Binging and overeating have similar. In both instances, you're eating more food than you likely need, but with binging, it's a bit of a different undertone as well as overeating. So I'm going to go into the origins of a binge cycle. What is a binge? Some triggers for binging. What is the difference between binging and overeating? And then we're going to talk about how we can free ourselves from this and from this cycle, and some things that we can do to create a healthier behavioral relationship with food. Because the first thing that I want to say is that binging and overeating is usually not triggered by food itself. It's not the food that is making us overeat. It's not the food that's making us binge. It is our emotional charge around eating and what food provides for us, what eating provides for us. And it's the quality of our mindfulness that is the cause of overeating and binging a lot of the time, right? Or, one of the causes. So what is binging, and what is the difference between binging and overeating? So the first thing I want to say about binging, obviously binging is when you eat a lot of food to a point of stuffed, right? To a point of being stuffed. And, when you're binging, you're not necessarily attuned to your hunger cues. You're not necessarily, always in your right mind as far as making decisions and choices around not only the act of eating, but a lot of times when we're binging, we're not even really tasting our food. We're really just eating the food to get some sort of resolution. And that inherently is the difference, one of the differences between binging and overeating. Binging in its most pure sense is a compulsion. I know for myself, when I would binge, it would almost be like I would not necessarily, but it wasn't even about tasting the food. It wasn't even about maybe in the beginning, I was tasting it and it tasted good. But if you continue to binge food and you're continuing to eat past a certain point, you're not tasting the food anymore. And it's not about getting satisfied. It's about trying to fill something else inside ourselves and get a certain need met. And overeating can be rooted in many things. So binging is overeating, but overeating is not binging. And I think that's a big difference, right? Not everybody who overeats is a binger. And I think that it's important to recognize within yourself the difference between that, because I think it can be really easy to get confused and think that, especially if you're just beginning your journey and thinking, oh, maybe, and you're like, I emotionally eat, and I realize I emotionally eat and I overeat a lot. So that must mean that I binge. That's not true. Okay. Overeating can be rooted in many things. It can be rooted in a belief system. It can be rooted in, one of the belief systems that is very common is what I like to call the human garbage can belief system, where we were taught that we can't let any food go to waste. We were taught that, we have to finish everything on our plate, that type of thing. There's some sort of guilt around or FOMO around not finishing something. There's a scarcity mindset where we overeat because maybe we're worried that there's not going to be anything left for us if we want more of it. There's just a lot of underlying belief systems that might not necessarily be our own. They can be generational belief systems. They can be narratives or like I said, beliefs that we subconsciously, unconsciously got from our upbringing and even just the modeling, right? It might not have even be told to us descriptively in that sense, but it's really just the way that we saw our caretakers or that we were modeled around food. We could see how people feel and act around food. Like, were they comfortable just saying, oh, I'm finished with this. I'm full. This was beautiful. This was lovely. This tasted delicious, but I'm stuffed now. I'm going to leave the rest. And I'm okay with, throwing it out if, especially if you go to a restaurant and you're not in charge of the portion size. And this is a big one. I feel like when I work with clients one-on-one a lot, I always say that you're not in charge of the size of the portion that the restaurant gives you. So if they give you a huge portion and you get halfway done and you're full or you're satisfied, this is an inflection point a lot where people with emotional eating or have these generational belief systems around eating struggle because we feel like we have to finish it. There's a certain feeling of that gets triggered of that I'll be missing out if I don't finish it. There's a lot of these underlying things. And so that's a major cause and trigger of overeating are these belief systems. And another cause of overeating can be mindless eating. A lot of times we overeat and it's mindless because we aren't connected to our needs in the moment. Okay, we mindlessly overeat because there are certain deeper needs. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these deeper needs. It's one of the things that I focus heavily on in my programs, especially Decoding Permanent Weight Loss, even in both my programs, the Emotional Eating Solution as well, where we focus heavily on what are our needs. Because when we can name them, when we can name our present experience, we almost break the spell of that mindlessness. When we can name our needs, we break that spell of mindlessness that is fostering and that's generating the overeating. So we can mindlessly overeat because we're not connected to our needs. And another thing can be that hustle culture, the way our nervous system in the modern times and definitely in society these days is conditioned to not be able to deal with boredom, right? Like we're such sensation junkies in this day and age that we're not really able to deal with boredom well. Deal with, just sitting with ourselves, not having stimuli, whether it's our phones or whether it's food, something that we're doing to, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, but be productive with our time in the moment. And overeating can be just like scrolling. Overeating can be that behavior that you do to try to ward away boredom. Okay, so we talked a bit about some of the overeating causes or some of the ways that overeating can happen, but let's talk about what some of the triggers are with binging. Because now that we understand that not everyone who overeats is a binger and that binging is a different animal, binging is a compulsion. There's a certain charge and energy under binging. And a lot of times binging, whereas overeating can be mindless. And again, like I said, it can be rooted in belief systems and also in this kind of modern society of not being able to deal with boredom, not getting our needs met. Binging is actually destructive and it's abusive to ourselves. It is a behavior that we do as a punishment to ourselves, rooted in deep self-judgment and unworthiness. And it's because we have self-judgment for not being perfect. We have self-judgment around not feeling in control. We have fear around not being in control. There's a sense of real irritability for not being in control. We feel this need to just lock it down, right? We just want to stop feeling uncertain. Okay. And a lot of times a big cause of binging is just being really hard on ourselves for just being human. And with binging, it's really about abusing ourselves. Whereas overeating, it is not as charged. It's not about that. It's not about making ourselves suffer. It's not about it's not about punishing ourselves for some inner judgment that we have about ourselves. And I think that it's really important to understand that mindset and, really working on our self-value, our self-love, our self-acceptance, our self-worth is one of the biggest ways to stop binging. Obviously we can binge when we're overcorrecting for restricting. So if you've ever been on a diet and you're in that mindset of not allowed to eat this, and so you'll kind of binge with urgency on something you're not supposed to eat, that happens. And maybe you're not necessarily punishing yourself in that instance per se, but you're abandoning your goal, but that's not so much about self-worth. That's just because you set yourself up to fail, right? By going on a diet or something that's restrictive or that requires you to follow some sort of guideline or rule for an extended period of time, most of the time we're going to rebel against that. That's more of a rebellion. That's not necessarily a punishment or a self-flagellation or abusive to yourself. It's more of a rebellion. And so there's a very big difference between, am I binging to rebel or am I binging to punish? And so that's something else that, is important to uncover, to understand about yourself. Because at the core of it all, when we binge, it's because we're crying out. We're crying out in pain. We feel so disempowered, so out of control. There's so much that we want to feel and experience and don't feel worthy for. And it's this unworthiness that we're not good enough to truly have the life that we want. So we use food to numb, right? We use food to get that good feeling at first. And then very quickly, and I could tell you that from experience, it switches into numbing, which disconnects us more from our true needs, our true wants, our true desires, the ability to embrace that mindset of worthiness. It takes us farther and farther away from that. Usually what happens when we do binge and we overeat for extended periods of time, we gain weight. And then it just all becomes very overwhelming and the weight becomes a shield, right? The weight then becomes an actual physical shield from the pain, from the fear, from the lack of belief that we're worthy. And so it is really important to understand the difference between binging and overeating. But I think where they converge is that when you overeat for extended periods of time and when you binge for extended periods of time, this is where the weight gain comes. But I think it's also really important. And for those of you who have been, listening for a while or, know that I don't believe that weight loss will give you the self-worth and the connection to yourself, to your intuition, to feeling empowered that you're looking for unless you do that other inner work, right? You do that other inner work of understanding your needs. What are some of the mindset blocks and belief systems that you have to heal? How can we grieve that? How can we feel safe and confident in creating new belief systems and letting go of old belief systems? How can we stay in that space between when we're healing those old belief systems, but the new belief systems haven't been congealed in us yet? How can we stay strong? How can we keep up the energy to keep going and to keep healing and to to not fall back into old ways. These are all things that are really important to do. And weight loss isn't going to get you those skills, right? Weight loss is really great for confidence, for sure, but it's not going to get you those skills. And so one of the key steps in freeing yourself from emotional eating is to forgive yourself, right? And is to create this compassionate, and sometimes in the beginning for me, I had to almost, I think I actually did do this where I had a list of compassionate qualities that was a me, right? It was like a higher self me, that this version of me would represent these compassionate qualities. And therefore, when I found myself in that really tight, that really small, tight, constricted place, numb place, when I would feel like that place of wanting to binge or just really just not feeling connected to my worth, I would call in that version of me, right? I'd call in that version of me with the qualities. I would look at the paper and I would expand my mindset to, to feel those qualities. And a lot of times, if you can't muster up that version of yourself to be that warm, loving presence for yourself, you could think about a person or a pet or somebody in your life that embodies and represents those compassionate and forgiving qualities. And you can imagine them giving you a big hug. You can imagine that person giving you a big hug and just softening some of those urgency edges, that those, that those constricting edges, so that you can feel just much more connected to, to your goodness, to your worthiness. And I think that's a really good way to start to just decompress some of the urgency that comes with binging, and also to bring some clarity and wake up from the numbing that can happen and from the mindlessness that could happen. That is a cause for the binging or for the overeating. And then, really try to get yourself to the place where you can release yourself from the need to punish, not having to be so hard on yourself. And that will come with wanting to do that. So I remember in the beginning for me as well, I wasn't always successful at that. But as I started to become more attuned to that feeling of, oh, I feel this urge to binge now, I would pause and I would say to myself, like, I don't need to punish myself here. So it's like just these small little things. And sometimes it wouldn't work, but sometimes it would. And every time it would, I would grow my capacity more for it to work the next time and work the next time until eventually, I wasn't binging anymore. And it could take a long time, but it doesn't have to take a long time, right? So it's all about your willingness to be present with yourself, to be that compassionate presence for yourself, however you find that to be good for you, whether that's like what I did, which was, write down qualities of a compassionate me and then call her in, or imagining a pet or a person and just being present, connecting to your needs, recognizing that you don't have to respond and react to that urgency feeling of wanting to binge. And it's really just about being able to be awake to your present moment. So when you notice you're overeating, to just stop and be like, maybe, what am I not feeling here? Okay, so these are just really important ways to break the pattern, to change the behavior. And once you do that and you get more in tune with eating as a natural rhythm, you're going to notice that you don't have these good and bad belief systems about food. You're not going to be scared of food. And honestly, the weight that you are carrying, if you are carrying extra weight that you're not happy with, will really just start to come off naturally. It is pretty amazing and a lot more easeful than some would let you think it is. It's much more easeful. It's much more innate. The body doesn't want to be in overprotection mode. So it wants to release the weight. And if you believe that, that also is an amazing, amazing thing to connect to. So on that note, thank you so much for joining me again today for today's episode. And if today's episode resonated with you, please join me again next week with another new one about emotional eating so you can fall in love with eating, start losing weight, and keep it off with sustainable strategies and lasting change. If you found this episode insightful and you are watching on YouTube today, please subscribe, leave a review on Apple, and share it with those who may benefit from this empowering knowledge. I have lots of free resources on my website to support you on your journey to loving food and losing weight. Just go to www.bewellbyak.com. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.